So let's talk just a minute in very general terms of industry structure and profitability, right? And we kind of look at it from a variety of perspectives, right? You can say, what about firms that have perfect competition? Or the industry has perfect competition. Now, perfect competition is exactly what you learned about in your macro and microeconomics classes, right? Of course, that assumes individuals can invest their money or buy any goods or services that they wish. You have a industry concentration where there are many firms and all the firms are roughly the same and they are offering products that are roughly the same. Furthermore, all customers have access to perfect information at all times. Now what that means, by the way, when customers have perfect information available to them at all times, think about this. You go to, I don't know, Walmart and you look at the milk, right? And you can take your milk and say, well, you know what, I know it's 10 cents cheaper at Target, so I'm going to leave here and go to Target. The customer can examine a product and they know all about the quality and the price of the product just like that. Now some of you are thinking, well, is that really true, right? Well, when Adam Smith assumed that customers had perfect information flow, people thought that was absurd, right? Adam Smith, writing in Glasgow, would say, that a bushel of grain in Glasgow was 1 shilling, and in Edinburgh it was £1, so the customers would know they didn't need to go to Edinburgh because it was cheaper in Glasgow. Well, that was an absurd assumption at that time because it would take a couple of days by carriage to get to Edinburgh. But today, I think this assumption is beginning to hold because of the fact that we have customers always on their smartphones, right? If you don't like the restaurant, you can Yelp it, talk about how bad it was, so customers have that information, they know not to go there. If you're not sure how much your milk should really cost, you can look it up on Google while you're at the grocery store. So I think this is actually becoming more and more relevant that we are having perfect information flow. Now we talk about many firms offering homogeneous or similar products. Now this is particularly true when we start talking about the dealing of commodities. Commodities are products that are relatively similar. Think about milk. Milk, yeah, there's some differences. There's lactose-free milk, almond milk, 2% skim, whatever. But within those specific categories, your 2% milk from one store and one vendor is pretty much the same as 2% milk from a different store or a different vendor. If you're buying bricks of gold, bars of gold, or bushels of grain, things of that nature, it's probably going to be about the same. That's a very different kind of logic than all the bells and whistles that people try to add on things like smartphone technologies or pharmaceutical drugs that are different and things like that. Now again, in perfect competition, there's no entry or exit barriers. It means that you can go and participate in that industry with no startup costs, no special fees, and when you decide you don't want to be in that industry anymore, you can leave without any sort of exit costs. Then we also have an oligopoly. Now that's when there's a handful of firms that are the dominant players in that industry. So you have just a few firms, not many, many firms. And there are significant barriers to entry and exit. Think about it again, I'll use the trucking example that I've talked about in some of my previous modules, right? Trucking is a good example of an oligopoly. There's a few trucking firms that kind of dominate the industry. And if you want to get into trucking, you've got to buy a lot of trucks and a lot of infrastructure just to get off the ground. So that's a significant entry barrier. But in an oligopoly, there's also a significant exit barrier. Let's say it's like, okay, I don't want to be a trucker anymore. Well, that's fine, but you've got to sell off all those trucks, you've got to sell off all the infrastructure, fire all those people, right? And it's going to take time to sell those trucks. And if you're in a hurry, you're going to have to take a significant loss in the price with which you are selling the truck. And so that's an exit barrier. And of course, in oligopoly, there is potential for differentiation. Again, we'll use the trucking example. Short haul trucking from city to city within usually a couple 100-mile radius versus long-haul trucking, taking goods across the country. Or maybe you have refrigerated trucking, like a cold truck to take milk from point A to point B would be very different than like a moving company's trucking business, right? So that would be some degree of differentiation. And of course, it'd be less perfect availability of information, right? meaning that it can be difficult for a consumer who's uninformed to compare the trucking services of one company to that of another because they may not fully understand the dynamics of the trucking industry. Okay. Additionally, as we start getting into oligopolies, as we shift from perfect competition, you start finding more profitability, right? Because you've had to overcome certain entry barriers and there's fewer firms against which you compete directly, and you have differentiation, this increases your amount of profitability. I mean, think about it on all four fronts, right? If you know exactly who your competitors are, you know, there's only a dozen of them, you can plan on how to get some sort of competitive advantage against them, versus having, you know, possibly limit this numbers of competitors in under perfect competition. And I forgot to write oligopoly on my board, but sorry about that. Got kind of excited. Okay. You had to overcome certain entry barriers which other firms were not able to overcome. Right? So that gives you a competitive advantage. When you have products that are different, that further reduces the number of competition that you have. And when customers aren't really able to understand the nature of your product, you can charge a higher price than you would normally, and the customer won't know any better. So that increases your potential for profitability. Now, a little bit more on the extreme side of an oligopoly would be a duopoly and a monopoly. Hopefully you can see me. Okay. So when you talk about a duopoly, that means two firms basically control the industry, and a monopoly would be that one firm. And again, the duopoly, two firms, monopoly, one firm. The barriers to getting into a duopoly are even higher than they are in an oligopoly. With a monopoly, they're extremely high. The product differentiation is even more important in a duopoly than it is a monopoly versus an oligopoly. And the availability of information gets even more scarce in duopoly and a monopoly versus an oligopoly. So we've given you kind of a macroeconomic bird's eye view of industry structure and profitability. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and what we're going to move on to next is Porter's 5 forces analysis, which is another way to help you understand whether you should enter a given industry or not, or whether a firm should enter a given industry or not. So I'm looking forward to seeing you then.